Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about cybersecurity careers and how to narrow down where you might actually fit in the industry. Now, a lot of career advice treats cybersecurity as if there's one clear starting point, but the jobs actually tell a very different story because once you start looking at the requirements and all of these details behind the job posting, you start noticing that a lot of these domains are actually pretty different from each other. And that becomes a problem because when you start trying to prepare for these roles, you can end up spending months trying to learn a useful skill only to find out that it doesn't actually line up with the position that you're interested in. So, in this presentation, basically what I'm going to do is organize the field into clean career paths and explain how you can use them to choose a realistic direction. We're going to start with the big picture first, how organizations divide cybersecurity work. Now, NIST's NICE framework gives us a very great big picture view. Instead of organizing cybersecurity by job titles, which can vary quite a bit between companies, it actually organizes the work by the purpose that it serves in the organization. And that is what makes the framework useful for when you're reading job postings. You don't need to memorize all of these categories right away. You just have to have a nice little run of them and use it to look past the title to understand what the employer is actually hiring someone to do. A position called security analyst could fit literally anywhere into these many different parts of the framework, depending on the responsibilities that you might be asked to have. Now, that is exactly why, in this way, I recommend reading job duties and requirements very carefully. They can reveal the problem that the employer needs someone to solve, which then tells you what kind of experience that the position is going to require and what you need to orient your resume to look like. So now that we understand the work behind the title, we can kind of start looking at where the work fits in within a larger career path. So knowing what a job actually involves is the first part of understanding, right? A career can be shaped by many different things. Like, for instance, the person you work for and how your responsibilities can grow over time. Take identity as an example. The basic purpose of the work stays the same, but an identity professional at a university may deal with very different circumstances and priorities than someone working at a bank. The domain gives them something in common, but the industry changes how that work is going to be applied. The same idea carries into career growth. The latter shows that gaining responsibility does not automatically mean becoming a manager. You can lead through management or you can continue developing as a technical expert, getting more and more niche. And they're different jobs, but one is not automatically above the other. Now, if you're just starting out, you do not need to make all of those decisions at once, okay? Begin with the domain because it's going to tell you what foundation that you need to build. Once that direction is clear, it becomes a lot easier to decide where you want to apply that knowledge and how you may want to grow later. So, for now, let's take a look at the major domains that make up the field and kind of get some details about that. All right. The first slide here shows half of the larger career map. But before we start looking at the individual areas, I kind of want to point out the note that's at the top. These are career families, not perfectly separate boxes. A real job can overlap in several different areas, especially in a smaller organization where one security team may be responsible for the whole kit and caboodle. Now, these categories are still useful to know because they show the main purpose behind the work that you may be doing. And as you look through the first half of this list, think less about the title that sounds impressive and more about what kind of problem you would actually want to spend your days solving. Now, some of these roles are centered on responding to immediate issues, while others focus on controlling risk before the incident occurs. Now, the remaining domains that we're going to be talking about in this next slide work into shaping things by more of the environment and the technology that's being protected. So let's kind of take a look at that. Now, you can see that shift in the second half of the map. Basically, security looks different when it is getting applied to a particular type of technology environment. Now, I'm not going to go and read every category or get too deep into that because the descriptions are pretty much already on screen. And there's a lot that kind of goes into that conversation more than length than I have in this video. Now, Ultimately, what matters is that these areas do not all have the same starting point. Someone interested in one domain may need a strong development background, while another path may grow naturally from business or IT support experience. That is why choosing a domain is so useful. It tells you which foundation matters for the kind of work that you want instead of leading you to study some random security topics and hope that they connect back later. Now, the clearest way to understand why these points differ is to follow a few of the ladders, beginning with a path closely tied to traditional IT. Now, security operations is that first useful example. The most important thing to notice on this ladder is, as I said before, where it begins. The first step is not a cybersecurity job. It's actually a foundational IT support role that teaches you how systems behave when everything is working normally. And that context becomes valuable later because in security operations, analysts have to recognize when something doesn't look right. So, as people gain experience, they're going to move from reviewing basic alerts into handling more and more complicated investigations. From there, the path can branch into the specialties that are shown a little bit higher up on the ladder. Now, the qualifications on this slide are going to give you a sense of what support work does and kind of what you can do to understand the concepts behind all of this a bit better. But the larger scale is just being able to understand what the security data is telling you and explain what should happen next. Now, I'm going to note this warning on the bottom here as well. Basically, this work, specifically this domain, can involve very difficult schedules and a very high volume of alerts. But at the same time, that can work in your favor because it will expose you to many different types of incidents and also kind of build up your constitution for stress and high octane environments. And it'll also create a lot of opportunities for you later. So keep that in mind. Now, the same understanding of systems in this context can also be used before an incident by testing whether those defenses can be broken. So we're going to kind of get into that kind of role next. Now, in offensive security, the question basically shifts from whether an attack is happening to whether one could succeed. And the work with this tests weaknesses before a real attacker gets the chance. Now, the point I want to kind of emphasize here is that the latter begins with an existing technical background. Social media can skew all sorts of things, but it really skews this role because it makes penetration testing seem like this default first job in cybersecurity, but in actuality, most people need time working with systems before they're ready to test them properly, or companies are ready for you to be responsible for them. Now, the job also involves more than just finding a way into a system, okay? The organization needs to understand what the weaknesses mean and how to correct them. That makes communication part of the technical work rather than something that happens after it through documentation and reporting structures. Now, the certifications on the slide can support your path, but they make more sense when they confirm skills that you have already practiced, meaning they shouldn't be treated as replacement for understanding or experience on the systems that you're trying to test. So, offensive security is just one destination. If your background is more closer to user support, though, another path may be a bit more connected to what you already do. So, let's kind of talk about it. Now, as I said, the identity ladder for those working with user accounts and access should look pretty familiar. This work pretty much grows naturally from the problems that support teams already handle. And as work becomes more advanced in this area, the focus shifts from solving one person's login problem to managing how access should work across the organization. Basically, the goal is to make sure that access changes when a person's role changes or that the organization can provide evidence on those decisions and make sure that they were handled correctly. Now, the platform knowledge that I mentioned here on the slide helps someone perform that work, but the larger concept is the relationship between people and systems. Identity professionals basically have to translate someone's role in the organization into the access that they should receive. Personally, this is the area that I'm most interested in because it sits between technical administration and the way that people actually work in workflows. It's almost needed everywhere, which gives a lot of people opportunity to grow and really find an industry that fits their interest. Now, one of those individual access decisions, once they're made, they have to be defended across the organization. And the work can kind of begin to overlap with governance, which we're going to get into in the next slide. Now, GRC and privacy take on a pretty broad responsibility. These are areas sometimes dismissed as the paperwork side of cybersecurity. But the paperwork is really just evidence of the decisions that the organization has made, and it's actually pretty important. Now, someone has to decide, obviously, which risks require action and then determine whether the company's protections actually meet that expectation. That is what the controls and frameworks on this slide are actually helping the organization measure. Now, the starting point is also a little bit different from the technical ladders that we've already seen. People can enter this work from backgrounds that taught them how organizations make decisions or prove requirements are being followed. Now, in this way, what matters most is just being able to understand risk and then explain it in a way that the rest of the business can use. Because if you kind of explain things, it kind of makes it to where the people that are working with you around you can actually make better decisions on their side. Because a technical issue doesn't necessarily exist in isolation, and neither does vulnerability. Someone has to be able to connect the effect that something could cause to what the organization is doing. Now, that is what makes GRC and privacy pretty open to a wider range of professional backgrounds, as you can see. And not every domain is open to this non technical experience. You're going to see that here in a second when we talk about cloud security, which gives us some pretty useful contrast. Now, cloud security sits further along the technical path. The note on this slide says this is not an entry point, as I will note. And the first step on the ladder kind of explains why. Basically, employers want cloud security professionals to understand how infrastructure is built and operated before asking them to protect it. Without that foundation, it is very difficult to know whether a security decision will actually work in a real environment. Now, the technologies listed on the slide are important, but learning the tools alone is not the same as understanding the system, as I've said before. A strong project should determine how your security decisions fit into something you built. And that means either a work project or a self started project if you want to do something like build a website or something along those lines. Now, you may notice that identity appears here again, right? And that is a good example of how domains can kind of overlap. Cloud security depends heavily on deciding which people and services should and should not have access to each resource. Now, protecting the infrastructure is just one layer of the problem, obviously. Securing the software it's built on is also another. So let's get into that. Now, application security moves us into the software layer that we were talking about. Basically, the beginning of this ladder shows why the path is closely connected to development. It is easier to secure the process when you already understand how the software moves from an idea into something that consumers can actually use. Now, finding vulnerabilities is just one part of the job. Okay, the security professional also has to help the development team fix it in a way that works for the product. That requires collaboration because the goal is to improve the software, not simply hand someone a report of everything that they did. Now, the knowledge areas shown on this slide provide a guide for what to study. When building a portfolio, though, focus on showing how you think. A project that explains how you found and corrected a problem is way more useful than a collection of tool screenshots or just some Bumbus report. Now, most of the consequences that we are talked about here and discussed so far remain purely inside the digital systems, right? But the next field that we're going to talk about can actually affect the physical world rather immediately. Now, operational technology raises the stakes because getting a decision wrong here, as we mentioned before, can interrupt a physical process or create a safety issue. The safest response is not always the same as it would be in a normal office environment because of this. For example, quickly taking a vulnerability system offline might sound like the safest response in certain scenarios in a normal business setting, but in a industrial setting, that decision could create a much larger problem than the vulnerability itself caused. So security basically has to kind of put their brains together and work within the needs of that operation. That is why, as you can see, the ladder begins with people who already understand the equipment and the environment. That's because their operational knowledge gives context to the security decisions that they're eventually going to make. Now, I'm going to note the thing that's up here, the apprenticeship note. It's important because some employers, what they like doing is training people directly because the combination of security and industrial knowledge can be really difficult to find out in the wild. And that can create, in a lot of ways, an opportunity, but also an overlooked route into the field for somebody who might prefer practical, more hands on work. Now, more than any other example so far, OT kind of shows us why the surrounding industry can completely reshape the security work. So we're kind of going to get into more things after this. Right. With all of our relationships in mind, we can now kind of look at the industries themselves. Here you can kind of see how the risk an organization faces shapes the security team that builds it. Now, you don't need to memorize which domains appear under which industry. The important point is just that employers invest in areas that are most connected to what their organizations are trying to protect or what their default business needs are. And that means that the same cybersecurity background may be valued differently depending on where you're applying or what you're looking for. Now, understanding the industry, it helps you present your experience in a way that connects to the employer's actual concerns. Now, one thing to mention before we move on, the salary figure at the bottom of this needs a bit of context because I know some people are gonna be like, whoa, I don't make that. But to preface, this is a national median across the occupation itself. So that includes people with years of experience. It's really useful for understanding the long term value of the field, but don't treat it as like this guaranteed entry level salary because it is not that. Now, the most recognizable employers are going to only tell part of that story, but we're going to kind of talk about these opportunities, like how I kind of mentioned before, where people might not know that they can get involved. So, those less obvious opportunities are what this second group highlights. Basically, each industry builds security around the work that it performs and the consequences it faces if something goes wrong. Now, higher education is a good example. Universities operate large technology environments and support many different types of users, so they can need broader security programs than sometimes people initially really believe. Now, that itself can create valuable opportunities for someone who is still developing experience. And I have had that opportunity myself. It's awesome. Now, the larger security lesson or career lesson here from these two slides is just that choosing both a domain and an industry can make your goal more specific. It gives you a clearer idea of which problems to study and which employers are likely to value your background. Now, a specific domain and industry can only get you so far. You have to actually show that your employer is ready. So we're going to kind of talk a little bit about showing off. Now, proving readiness is the focus of this slide, obviously. The two percentages are almost identical, and that is the point. Experience and certifications are not competing paths, they answer different questions for an employer. A certification shows that you can understand the foundation, experience or a strong project can show that you know how to use it. Basically, the proof stack on the slide works because each layer supports the others instead of trying to all stand on their own. Now, being able to explain your decisions is also especially important because an interviewer may ask why you configured something a certain way or what you would change in a real organization. Your explanation shows whether you understood the work or simply followed a tutorial. Now, the note here I want to make is that people skills matter for the same reason, okay? Security professionals have to be able to help other people understand a problem well enough to act on it. So technical knowledge loses all value if you do not know how to communicate. And I have seen more than my fair share of shy, introverted people who come into this industry and do not understand that no, you can't just go hide in a cave. You actually have to go talk to people and you actually have to communicate what your needs, wants, and desires are. Otherwise, this whole system collapses. Now, one of the things I want to point out is that in this next slide is that education can support this proof stack as well, although people are going to either give it too much or not enough weight, and we're going to talk about that in a second. All right, the degree question, because it always comes up. Now, this becomes easier to answer when we treat education as one form of evidence rather than the entire qualification, okay? Its value still depends on what you're trying to do. Now, a degree can help someone pass an initial screening process, especially when it is listed as a requirement, as it is on most applications and job postings at this point. Now, it doesn't prove that the person can perform the work, okay? Which is why projects and experience from the previous slide that I was kind of mentioning still matter. Now, the sections on this slide also show that different education levels serve different purposes. More education is not automatically better for every single stage of a career. It just supports the kind of work you want to do rather than becoming this credential that you've collected without a clear reason. Now, someone without a degree, and I've talked about this before, they can still build a career, but that's going to come from nepotism or a lot of hard networking and opportunities that, quite frankly, are just not very abundant. And that means that when they go to do this stuff, the rest of their background is going to have to work as hard as a 4-year degree. And that's a lot. So, just to say, even with the right qualifications, there are some things that we have to consider. All right. And one of those things is the number and the type of available jobs, which is going to be what we're talking about next. Now, market data is going to add a lot of missing context, but the headline numbers can be really easy to misunderstand. Basically, the figures on this slide show that cybersecurity work is currently growing, a little bit less now that we're having some economic problems here in the US, but they do not mean here that there are thousands of entry level security jobs waiting to be filled. Basically, the largest figure that we see here includes adjacent technology roles that carry significant security responsibilities. The smaller federal estimate really focuses more narrowly on information security analysts. Now, those measurements are related, but they are not necessarily describing exactly the same group of jobs. Also, to mention, experience level creates another difference. Basically, employers may have difficulty finding people who specialize in certain kinds of experience while still receiving large numbers of applications for junior positions. That is just how the field is right now. Basically, what we're going through is a workforce shortage followed by an entry level bottleneck. And that can create a lot of room for growth for people who fit that exact type, but it is not, again, evenly distributed across every type of role. So, the practical lesson here is not that beginners should throw in the towel and give up and cry. It's just that a general interest in cybersecurity is just simply not enough anymore. And to stand out in a competitive field, you have to show that this is what I want and this is what I want to go after. Now, the best response to all of that is basically not broad preparation, but clearer targeting. And we're going to talk about that in the next slide. All right. What does a clearer target look like in practice? Well, the advice on this slide comes basically directly from the patterns that we've seen throughout this presentation. If you're starting out, choose a domain so that you can build the foundation that work actually requires. Then what you're going to do is create evidence that resembles the job instead of building unrelated projects just because they're labeled cybersecurity. Now, adjacent experience kind of counts as well. Most of the ladders that you kind of have seen us look at begin outside of a security title, which means that an earlier role can still move you forward if it teaches you something that your target role needs. Now, if you already have experience, your goal is going to shift from trying to know everything to becoming more valuable in a specific area. Advancement also depends on understanding how your work affects the organization, especially if you move toward technical leadership or management. Now, all of this to say, there is a better question here than how do I get into cybersecurity? It's what do I want to protect? And what would I do to prove that I can protect it? It's so much of a more specific, simpler question. And once you can answer those two things, the general goal of working in cybersecurity actually becomes a path that you can realistically follow. Now, the next step here is turning all of those paths into its own practical guide. So every domain on this list deserves a closer look at the daily work and how somebody can actually prepare for it. So please, in the comments, let me know which one you would like me to cover next, and I will use the most requested area for the deepest next dive. So please follow for more Minx Jinx and get some cybersecurity resources and straightforward career advice, as I will see you in the next one.